Fame promises glamour, perfection, and the illusion that some people simply have everything. But behind the spotlights, many stars built entire careers on carefully crafted lies. Hidden marriages, forged backstories, fabricated origins, secret identities, and entire personas designed to fool audiences for decades. Some of these lies were harmless until they spiraled out of control. Others were destructive enough to destroy lives, careers, or even lead to tragedy. But how many of these stories were created by the stars themselves? And how many were manufactured by studios desperate to protect their image? What scandals were buried, rewritten, or erased to keep fans believing the fantasy? And what happened when the truth finally came out? Tonight on Tick Tick, we peel back the curtain on the stars who lived double lives. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe. These hidden stories are only getting darker from here. Which secret do you think will shock you the most? 15. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson's entire career was built on a lie he was forced to maintain in order to survive the brutal machinery of old Hollywood. To the public, he was the ultimate romantic leading man, tall, masculine, charming, and the perfect heartthrob for a generation of moviegoers. Studio executives crafted his image with precision, presenting him as the idealized symbol of traditional masculinity. Every magazine spread, every interview, and every public appearance reinforced this fantasy. But behind the scenes, he was living a life that contradicted everything the studio claimed he was. Hudson was a gay man in an industry where that truth could destroy a career overnight. Studio contracts in that era heavily controlled the private lives of actors, and Hudson's personal identity became a closely guarded secret managed by publicists and executives. He was pressured into orchestrated relationships with actresses, staged dates, and even a short-lived marriage arranged solely to protect his public persona. The emotional strain of hiding who he truly was weighed heavily on him, yet he continued performing the role the world expected. The lie did not stop at his romantic life. His entire brand, every article, every fan message was built on the illusion of heterosexual perfection. The studio's power over his personal narrative was absolute, leaving him trapped inside an image he never had full ownership of. Even his friends had to follow strict guidelines when speaking about him publicly. For decades, Hudson navigated fame through secrecy, fear, and careful management of every word spoken about him. His life took a tragic turn when he was diagnosed with AIDS, a diagnosis the industry urged him to hide. When the truth finally became public, it shattered Hollywood's carefully curated facade. His illness forced the world to confront the reality of who he was and highlighted the immense pressure many stars faced to hide their identity. Hudson became unintentionally one of the most significant public figures in raising awareness of the AIDS crisis, but at the cost of his privacy and dignity. Rock Hudson's story remains one of Hollywood's most heartbreaking examples of a star forced to live a lie just to keep the machine of fame running. 14. Doris Day. Doris Day was celebrated as the eternal girl next door, a wholesome icon whose sunny optimism became a defining part of Hollywood's golden age. To audiences, she embodied innocence, warmth, and moral purity, an image polished so perfectly that it seemed unbreakable. But behind the cheerful persona, she lived a life shaped by secrecy, manipulation, and a long list of hidden struggles that contradicted everything the studios sold to the public. Her story is a reminder that even the brightest smiles can hide the darkest truths. The lie began early in her career, when studio executives altered her age, softened her backstory, and carefully rewrote her personal life to fit the image they needed. Publicists constructed a narrative of a carefree woman untouched by hardship, masking the reality that she had endured a tumultuous upbringing and abusive relationships. By the time she became a box office sensation, the character of Doris Day was a studio-manufactured personality that she had no choice but to inhabit. Her marriages were another hidden turmoil. The public believed she was living a charmed life, yet in private she suffered through emotional and financial betrayal. Her third husband secretly controlled her career, isolated her, and made decisions that destroyed her finances without her knowledge. Day later discovered that she had been signed to multiple projects against her will, all to cover debts she never agreed to. The woman known for playing independent, confident heroines was in reality trapped by manipulation and deception in her own home. Even her financial collapse was concealed from the public for years. She was forced into starring in a television series she never wanted solely to recover the money stolen from her. Though she performed professionally, the persona she projected on screen hid the exhaustion and fear behind it. Every smile she delivered to viewers masked the pressure and instability she faced off-camera. The truth was further complicated by her unwavering desire to protect her public image. She continued the illusion of effortless joy even as she privately managed anxiety, grief, and deep personal wounds. Her fans saw her as a symbol of light. Few knew how much darkness she had walked through to maintain that glow. Doris Day's life demonstrates how Hollywood can shape, rewrite, and even erase the truth of a person for the sake of marketable perfection. Behind her immaculate reputation was a woman forced to live a life that never fully belonged to her. 13. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis rose to fame as one of the most charismatic, photogenic leading men of mid-century Hollywood. To the public, he was the smooth-talking heartthrob with matinee idol good looks, a charming personality, and an irresistible screen presence. His studios promoted him as the ultimate success story, a handsome young man who climbed from the streets of New York to the peak of fame through talent and determination. But the image that audiences adored was only a small fragment of who he really was, and much of his public persona was constructed on carefully hidden truths he fought to suppress. Curtis spent much of his career hiding his origins. Born Bernard Schwartz to impoverished Hungarian Jewish immigrants, his childhood was marked by poverty, violence, and instability. Yet the Hollywood version of Tony Curtis omitted nearly all of that. Executives insisted he change his name, alter his accent, and reshape his cultural identity. His real background was considered unmarketable, so it was buried. In interviews, Curtis was discouraged from speaking honestly about his upbringing, and instead coached to present a polished narrative of effortless charm and glamour. He also maintained a long illusion of being the confident, carefree playboy Hollywood wanted. Behind the swagger was a man deeply insecure about his heritage, his appearance, and his place in the industry. His pursuit of perfection led him into addictions he carefully concealed, including struggles with substances that nearly destroyed his career. Even at the height of his fame, he lived in constant fear that the real version of himself would be exposed and rejected, but by a studio system that valued image far more than authenticity. Curtis's personal relationships were equally complicated. His highly publicized marriage to Janet Leigh was pitched as a fairy tale romance, carefully photographed and widely marketed as one of Hollywood's most glamorous unions. But behind closed doors, their marriage was strained by jealousy, career pressures, and Curtis's attempts to maintain his crafted persona. Much of what fans believed about his romantic life was shaped by publicity teams intent on preserving the illusion of a picture-perfect leading man. As Curtis aged, the gap between his real identity and the character he performed for the world grew increasingly painful. He later admitted that he spent decades pretending to be someone he wasn't, someone he thought Hollywood wanted him to be. Tony Curtis remains a stark reminder of how deeply a star can become trapped inside a lie, especially when that lie is the foundation of their fame. 12. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's rise to legendary status came with a carefully engineered mythology that masked the harsh reality she lived behind closed doors. To the world, she was the magical, eternally youthful voice of optimism, an icon whose performance in The Wizard of Oz made her a symbol of innocence and wonder. But the persona audiences adored was built on decades of manipulation, control, and secrecy imposed by the studio system. Garland's public life was a dazzling fantasy. Her private life was shaped by pressure, exploitation, and pain that Hollywood worked relentlessly to hide. From the beginning, Garland was treated less like a young actress and more like a product. Executives at her studio decided nearly every aspect of her identity, how she should look, how she should speak, how she should behave, and even how much she should weigh. She was forced onto strict diets, fed pills to stay awake, and given other pills to sleep. These practices were hidden from the public, replaced with press narratives, portraying her as a naturally energetic, cheerful performer. The lie extended so far that Garland herself grew up believing she was never good enough unless she lived up to the image the studio demanded. Her age and appearance were constantly manipulated. Publicists controlled how she was photographed, what she wore, and which personal stories were permitted in interviews. Hollywood promoted her as a wholesome girl-next-door type, masking the intense self-doubt and emotional turmoil she endured. While audiences saw a bright, confident star, she battled exhaustion, addiction, and a profound sense of isolation created by the system that built her fame. Her relationships also became part of the illusion. Each romance was scrutinized, managed, or reframed to maintain her marketable persona. Studio executives intervened in her marriages, crafted false narratives for magazines, and buried conflicts that contradicted the sweetheart image they insisted she keep. Even as her private life grew increasingly tumultuous, Hollywood continued to present her as an icon untouched by hardship. As she grew older, Garland struggled against the expectations tied to the persona she never chose. Her real voice, her fears, her pain, her exhaustion was consistently overshadowed by the character the industry had forced her to play. Fans saw a radiant performer. Few knew how deeply she suffered to keep the fantasy alive. Judy Garland's life remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of a star forced to live a lie, her true self sacrificed to maintain an illusion the world demanded. 11. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was the embodiment of a new kind of Hollywood star, vulnerable, introspective, and deeply human in a way that contrasted with the polished masculinity of earlier leading men. To the public, he was a brilliant actor who seemed effortlessly soulful, a man whose emotional depth made him irresistible on screen. But behind that quiet intensity was a life shaped by secrecy, self-doubt, and internal battles he worked tirelessly to conceal. His fame rested on a delicate balance between truth and performance, and much of what the world believed about him was a carefully protected illusion. At the core of Clift's lie was his personal identity. In an era when being openly gay could destroy a career, he hid his private life with extreme vigilance. Friends and studio associates were forced into silence, and Clift maintained an ambiguous, carefully neutral public persona to avoid scrutiny. While magazines portrayed him as a romantic figure, surrounded by beautiful actresses, his real relationships were quietly kept out of the press. Hollywood desperately needed him to fit a specific mold, and Clift complied not by choice but by survival. After his devastating car accident in the mid-1950s, Clift's life became even more complicated. Publicists minimized the severity of his injuries, crafting narratives that framed him as resilient and recovering gracefully. In reality, the crash left him in chronic pain, dependent on alcohol and medication, and increasingly isolated. The lie that he was still the same youthful star helped studios protect their investments, but it forced Clift to continue performing through severe physical and emotional suffering. His on-screen brilliance further masked the truth. Audiences perceived his performances as raw and authentic, unaware that much of that intensity was shaped by his inner turmoil. Critics praised his vulnerability without understanding how much of it came from a life lived in conflict with himself, with his body, and with the expectations imposed upon him. Clift also hid his deteriorating mental health. Fearful of losing roles, he concealed his struggles from producers and fans. His close circle described him as a man torn between the desire to live honestly and the crushing need to maintain the persona that sustained his career. The industry's silence around his pain allowed the illusion to continue until his decline became impossible to hide. Montgomery Clift's life remains one of Hollywood's most tragic examples of a star living behind a mask, brilliant on screen but burdened with secrets that shaped every moment of his fame. 10. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow was presented to the world as the original blonde bombshell, a dazzling figure whose blend of innocence and sensuality reshaped Hollywood's image of female stardom. To audiences, she seemed effortless, glamorous, radiant, and always in control. But beneath the carefully bleached hair, immaculate styling, and perfectly staged publicity photos was a life shaped by secrecy, reinvention, and personal pain that studios worked aggressively to conceal. Much of what the world believed about Harlow was a myth carefully crafted to turn her into an icon instead of a fully human woman. Her persona as the irresistible platinum blonde was itself a manufactured lie. The hair color that became her trademark was achieved through a harsh bleaching process that caused severe damage, yet publicity campaigns glamorized it as natural perfection. Studio executives turned her appearance into a spectacle, using it to distract from the truth of her upbringing. Her insecurities and the vulnerabilities they feared would undermine her marketability. The public saw a confident, provocative star. Harlow privately battled body image issues and pressure to maintain a beauty standard that was physically painful and emotionally draining. Her personal life was equally distorted. Hollywood shielded her from scandal by manipulating narratives around her relationships and tragedies. When her husband, Paul Byrne, died under mysterious circumstances, the studio swiftly crafted a polished explanation to protect her career even though many details were concealed or altered. Harlow was forced into silence while MGM controlled the story, portraying her as a heartbroken widow rather than a woman caught in a complex and traumatic situation. The public perception of her remained pure, glamorous, and untouched by darkness, even as she privately endured grief and confusion. Financial struggles were another hidden truth. Despite her fame, Harlow was not as wealthy as fans believed. Much of her money was lost through mismanagement and the demands of supporting her controlling mother. Yet the studio insisted on maintaining the illusion of luxury. Harlow often appeared in extravagant gowns and lavish settings on screen, while living with financial instability behind the scenes. Her declining health was the final secret Hollywood refused to acknowledge. As her kidneys failed, studios attributed her frailty to exhaustion or dieting, refusing to let the truth interfere with film schedules. Even when she was gravely ill, the public was assured she would recover. Jean Harlow's legacy remains luminous, but her life reveals a star forced to live behind a glittering lie, one crafted by an industry that valued illusion over truth. If stories like hers keep you watching, don't forget to subscribe to Tick Tick for more hidden Hollywood revelations. 9. Clark Gable. Clark Gable, known worldwide as the King of Hollywood, carried an image of effortless masculinity, rugged charm, and unshakable confidence. His on-screen presence made him appear invincible, a man who seemed born for stardom, adored by women, and respected by men. But behind this powerful facade was a life carefully engineered through studio manipulation hidden insecurities, and long-buried truths about his background and personal struggles. Much of Gable's public identity was a constructed lie designed to protect the myth surrounding him. One of the biggest hidden realities of Gable's life was the truth about his early years. The studios worked hard to mask his humble, chaotic upbringing. Raised in poverty and far from the glamour he later projected, Gable's past was rewritten to align with Hollywood's vision of a confident, self-made hero. His rough childhood, strained family relationships, and lack of formal education were seldom mentioned publicly. Instead, audiences received a polished narrative that fit the persona MGM needed to sell the perfect leading man. Even Gable's iconic confidence was a carefully preserved illusion. In private, he was deeply insecure about his appearance, especially his teeth, which were in poor condition due to childhood neglect. The studio paid for extensive dental work, but insisted the truth remain secret. His polished smile became part of his marketable persona, yet it was a constant reminder of the parts of himself he felt forced to hide. His romantic life was equally shaped by deception. Hollywood adored the story of Gable and Carole Lombard as a golden couple, and while their love was real, many other aspects of his relationships were managed by publicists. Multiple affairs were concealed, and his complicated behavior toward colleagues, especially his coldness and emotional distance, was downplayed to preserve the myth of him as a gentleman hero. After Lombard's tragic death, Gable's grief was presented to the public as noble resilience, but in reality it devastated him, plunging him into years of emotional turmoil he never openly addressed. Another hidden truth was his internal struggle with guilt and personal responsibility. Stories circulated quietly about his involvement in events he would never publicly acknowledge, including the whispered claim that his actions may have indirectly contributed to a tragic accident. Though never confirmed, the fear of exposure haunted him for years. Clark Gable's public life was a masterpiece of Hollywood illusion. Audiences saw a king. Behind the throne was a man shaped by secrets, sorrow, and a lifelong effort to maintain a lie the world desperately wanted to believe. 8. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe became the single most recognizable symbol of beauty and desire in the 20th century, an icon whose image defined an era. To the world, she was the ultimate fantasy, playful, radiant, irresistibly confident, and effortlessly glamorous. But that version of Marilyn, the flirtatious blonde who lit up every camera, was a persona carefully engineered by studios' publicists and even Monroe herself. Behind the shimmering facade was a woman living a life entirely different from the fantasy the world adored. Her identity began as a constructed lie. Born Norma Jean Mortensen. Monroe grew up in foster homes, group facilities, and unstable environments marked by neglect and trauma. The studios erased that reality. Press releases painted her as a carefree California beauty with a sunny upbringing hiding the painful truth of her fractured childhood. Even her name, hair color, and mannerisms were manufactured to turn her into something more marketable. The Marilyn Monroe the world celebrated was in many ways a character she performed. Another hidden truth was her profound insecurity. Despite her image as the embodiment of confidence, Monroe suffered from severe self-doubt and anxiety. She worked tirelessly to perfect her on-screen presence, studying poses, practicing expressions, and developing the breathy voice that became her trademark. Publicists framed her as an effortless, natural talent, concealing the enormous pressure she felt to maintain the illusion of perfection. Her frequent lateness, often reported as diva behavior, was usually the result of panic attacks and emotional instability rather than arrogance. Her relationships became another layer of illusion. The world saw her marriages and romances as glamorous chapters in a fairy tale life. In reality, They were marked by misunderstanding, jealousy, and emotional turmoil. Studios manipulated narratives to protect her marketability, suppressing scandals, reworking timelines, and presenting Monroe as either an innocent victim or a carefree romantic, depending on what sold best. Her deepest connections were often hidden from the public, while the most superficial ones were exaggerated for headlines. The biggest lie of all was the notion that Monroe lived a charmed life. Behind the camera, she battled loneliness, substance dependency, and a desperate search for stability she never found. Her desire to be taken seriously as an actress was overshadowed by the very image that made her famous. Even as she tried to reinvent herself through serious roles and personal growth, Hollywood continued to push the persona she had outgrown. Marilyn Monroe lived a life defined by contrast, adored but isolated, adored but misunderstood, powerful but fragile. Her fame was built on a lie so strong that even she struggled to separate herself from it. 7. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood was one of Hollywood's brightest stars, a child actress who seamlessly transitioned into adulthood and became a symbol of grace, vulnerability, and cinematic elegance. To the public, she appeared to live a privileged, almost enchanted life, an actress who enjoyed early success, glamorous roles, and a seemingly perfect marriage. But much of that image was an illusion crafted by studios' managers and even her own family. The real Natalie Wood lived behind layers of secrecy, fear, and carefully protected truths that rarely made it into the public eye. One of the biggest hidden elements of her life was the intense pressure she faced from childhood. Her mother, driven by ambition and superstition, manipulated nearly every part of her early career. Wood's charming, confident public image concealed the reality of a young girl who was pushed relentlessly, often using fear as motivation. The world saw a naturally gifted child star. Wood privately endured emotional manipulation and the constant fear of disappointing those who controlled her path. Her romantic life was equally shaped by deception. Hollywood presented her marriage to Robert Wagner as a storybook union between two glamorous stars. In truth, their relationship was complicated, marked by insecurity, jealousy, and long periods of emotional distance. Studio publicists transformed even their most turbulent moments into polished narrative arcs, shielding fans from the reality that Wood struggled with loneliness, confusion, and the heavy burden of public expectations. The perfect marriage image was so heavily marketed that Wood often felt forced to maintain it, even when it no longer reflected her reality. There were also darker secrets surrounding Wood's personal fears. She battled anxiety throughout her life, stemming from a traumatic childhood incident that left her terrified of dark water. Yet her vulnerability was carefully hidden to protect her strong, composed public persona. Hollywood rarely allowed its stars to show weakness, and Wood became adept at masking her fears behind a soft smile and a carefully rehearsed charm. The greatest secrecy of all surrounded the circumstances of her tragic death. Her drowning became one of the most enduring mysteries in Hollywood history. But even before that, the truth of her emotional life was never fully shared with the public. The industry worked tirelessly to preserve her image as a beloved, ethereal beauty, even as unresolved tensions, hidden conflicts, and private struggles defined her real story. Natalie Wood's life was a carefully managed illusion, one that the world accepted wholeheartedly, unaware of the fragile person behind the timeless Hollywood glow. 6. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth was marketed as the ultimate screen goddess, an exotic beauty whose elegance and sensuality defined an entire generation of Hollywood glamour. To audiences, she appeared effortlessly confident, mesmerizing in every frame, and blessed with a life as enchanting as the characters she played. But almost every part of her public persona was a lie carefully manufactured by studios and publicists, hiding a complex and often painful reality behind the glittering illusion. One of the biggest deceptions was her identity. Born Margarita Cancino to a Spanish-Mexican father and an Irish-American mother, she did not fit the industry's rigid expectations for a leading lady. To make her more marketable, Columbia Studios completely remade her. They forced her to undergo painful and repeated electrolysis treatments to raise her naturally low hairline, lighten her hair to a striking copper red, reshape her eyebrows, and completely erase any trace of her ethnic heritage. The public believed she was a glamorous American star. In truth, she had been pressured into abandoning her own cultural identity to satisfy Hollywood's narrow ideals. Her personal life, sold to audiences as passionate and glamorous, was far more troubled. Behind the scenes, Hayworth endured controlling relationships and deeply painful experiences that were kept out of the spotlight. Her father pushed her into performing as a child, and their relationship was marked by emotional and physical boundaries that were never discussed publicly but left long-lasting scars. The studios worked tirelessly to conceal this dark chapter, crafting a polished backstory that emphasized her discovery rather than the exploitation that shaped her early life. Her marriages also became part of the lie. The world saw her as a desirable, wealthy superstar who could choose any partner she wanted. But in private, Hayworth was often drawn to men who tried to control her or reshape her identity further. Her marriage to Prince Ali Khan was marketed as a fairy tale romance, yet it was fraught with cultural tension, isolation, and emotional turmoil. The public image of a glamorous princess sharply contrasted with her reality of loneliness and constant scrutiny. Hayworth also struggled intensely with mental health and early-onset Alzheimer's disease long before the world knew the truth. As her memory and health declined, the studios attributed her struggles to unprofessional behavior, reinforcing a lie that she was unreliable and difficult. Few knew she was battling a devastating illness that was misdiagnosed for years. Rita Hayworth lived a life built on reinvention, sacrifice, and painful secrets. The world adored the fantasy, never realizing how much she lost to keep that illusion alive. 5. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was celebrated as Hollywood royalty, an actress of extraordinary beauty, undeniable talent, and a public life filled with glamour and spectacle. To the world, she seemed larger than life, the embodiment of luxury and passion, a woman who moved through fame with confidence and ease. But behind that dazzling exterior was a complex, deeply vulnerable person living with secrets, carefully managed narratives, and emotional wounds hidden beneath decades of Hollywood mythology. One of the biggest illusions surrounding Taylor was the idea that she was naturally confident and impervious to pressure. In truth, she struggled with insecurity from childhood. She was thrust into the spotlight at an early age, her appearance scrutinized relentlessly by studio executives who made decisions about her body, her clothes, and even her diet. The public saw a poised young actress. The private reality was a girl forced to perform perfection, learning early that her value was tied to how the world viewed her. Her famously dramatic romantic life was another source of misconception. The public devoured stories of her marriages and affairs, believing she lived a life of passion and excess. But behind the headlines was a woman searching desperately for stability, affection, and emotional safety. Many of her relationships were fueled by loneliness rather than luxury. Publicists further distorted the truth by amplifying scandals, hiding heartbreaks, and reshaping narratives to maintain her status as a glamorous icon rather than a woman facing real emotional turmoil. Taylor also lived with chronic pain that the world knew little about. After a debilitating back injury early in life, she spent decades quietly battling physical suffering. The studios insisted on preserving her image as flawless and indestructible, downplaying her hospitalizations and hiding the truth about her dependency on pain medication. Audiences continued to see her as radiant and resilient, unaware of the physical struggles that shaped her daily existence. Her identity was further complicated by the expectations placed on her. She was often portrayed as extravagant, impulsive, and endlessly dramatic, yet those qualities were magnified by decades of public scrutiny. In reality, Taylor carried heavy emotional burdens, including grief, guilt, and the pressure of living up to an icon's image she never fully controlled. Despite her fame, she often felt trapped inside the persona Hollywood created for her, a persona that overshadowed her intelligence, her activism, and her resilience. The world admired the legend. Few understood the woman behind it. Elizabeth Taylor's life was a constant balancing act between truth and illusion, an extraordinary star who lived behind a glamorous lie she never entirely escaped. 4. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was immortalized as Hollywood's swashbuckling golden boy, the fearless adventurer, the irresistible rogue, the embodiment of charm and danger. His on-screen persona seemed so natural, so effortless, that audiences believed he lived exactly as he appeared, bold, carefree, and endlessly charismatic. But behind that glamorous facade was a life built on secrecy, self-invention, and reputational manipulation. Much of what the world believed about Flynn was a lie designed to maintain the myth that made him a star. One of Flynn's greatest illusions was the cultivated image of heroic masculinity. In reality, he was deeply insecure, often uncertain of his own talent, and plagued by the fear that he was a fraud in an industry that valued perfection. The charismatic confidence he projected on screen masked a pattern of reckless behavior, self-destructive impulses, and emotional instability. Publicists carefully hid these issues, promoting instead the idea of Flynn as a naturally gifted, effortlessly daring leading man. His backstory was also heavily manipulated. Flynn encouraged and at times invented stories about his exotic past, claiming adventures in faraway places, heroic exploits, and dramatic encounters that often had little basis in truth. These tales made him appear larger than life, and studios eagerly embraced them, weaving his invented history into his publicity narrative. The world saw a real-life adventurer. In reality, many of his supposed exploits were embellishments or outright fabrications. Flynn's private life was even more complicated. His relationships were turbulent, marked by emotional volatility and behavior that was frequently hidden from the public. When scandals emerged, including allegations that could have destroyed his career, the studio launched an aggressive campaign to protect him. Publicists reframed events, buried damaging details, and spun narratives that portrayed Flynn as a misunderstood star, targeted by sensationalism. Audiences fed a curated version of the truth, continued to adore him. His decline was another aspect the industry hid. As Flynn aged, he struggled with addiction, health issues, and financial instability, yet the studio system maintained the illusion of a charming, rogue living life on his own terms. His exhaustion, emotional turmoil, and deteriorating health were masked behind press releases that insisted he was as vibrant as ever. Errol Flynn's life was built on a grand performance both on and off the screen. The daring hero the world adored was a fragile, conflicted man trapped inside a persona he could never fully escape. 3. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was known as one of the most breathtaking women in Hollywood history, a magnetic presence whose beauty seemed almost unreal and whose life appeared to be a whirlwind of glamour, romance, and luxury. To the public, she was the ultimate femme fatale, a woman who lived boldly, loved fiercely, and moved through the world with a confidence few could match. But behind that dazzling image was a woman carrying heavy secrets, insecurities, and a lifelong battle against the lies Hollywood constructed around her. One of the biggest illusions surrounding Gardner was the idea that she was effortlessly glamorous. In truth, she came from deep rural poverty in North Carolina, far removed from the polished sophistication associated with her public persona. Studios rewrote her background to make it more palatable, downplaying her humble origins and reshaping her early life into a fairy tale of discovery. The public saw a natural-born star. Gardner felt like an outsider trapped inside an identity that never truly belonged to her. Her romantic life, much like her career, was distorted by Hollywood myth-making. Gardner was famously linked to powerful men, most notably Frank Sinatra, leading many to believe she lived a life of fiery passion and emotional intensity. But behind closed doors, her relationships were marked by insecurity, fear of abandonment, and the emotional scars from growing up in a family that struggled financially and emotionally. Publicists exaggerated her romances, suppressing the painful moments and amplifying the fantasy. Gardner often felt powerless as tabloids divided her into either a seductress or a villain, neither of which reflected her reality. Another hidden truth was Gardner's profound insecurity about her talent. Despite her success, she doubted her abilities as an actress and felt uncomfortable with the roles that reduced her to little more than a beautiful face. Studios emphasized her looks at the expense of her depth, forcing her into roles that intensified the lie that beauty was her only value. Behind the scenes, she longed to be taken seriously, but Hollywood repeatedly prioritized her image over her craft. Her later years revealed even more of the lie. As she struggled with health issues and emotional exhaustion, the glamorous image persisted in public memory. Few knew the extent of her loneliness, her battles with alcohol, or how deeply she longed for a life defined by authenticity rather than illusion. Ava Gardner lived a life shaped by contradictions, a woman celebrated for her beauty, but burdened by the lies that beauty demanded. 2. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake rose to fame as one of the most distinctive and mesmerizing figures of the 1940s. Her signature peekaboo hairstyle became a cultural phenomenon, copied by millions, and cementing her status as a Hollywood enigma. To the world, she appeared mysterious, alluring, and entirely in control of her image, an actress whose cool, detached glamour made her seem untouchable. But behind that facade was a life riddled with hardship, instability, and carefully concealed truths that contradicted everything the public believed about her. One of the deepest illusions surrounding Lake was the idea that she was naturally poised and sophisticated. In reality, she grew up in difficult circumstances, marked by family turmoil, financial instability, and profound insecurity. Studio executives quickly realized that her striking looks could be shaped into a marketable persona, and they remade her image from the ground up. Her birth name, her personal history, and even her age were altered or obscured to create a more polished, glamorous backstory. The Veronica Lake the world knew was in many ways a character carefully manufactured by others. Her success came with pressures she was never prepared to handle. Though she appeared self-assured on screen, she struggled with untreated mental health issues and emotional instability that the studios worked tirelessly to hide. Publicists attributed her erratic behavior to diva tendencies rather than acknowledging the deeper psychological struggles she faced. The world saw a woman with icy control. The truth was far more fragile. The iconic hairstyle that made her famous became another burden. It limited her film roles, shaped her entire identity, and even caused problems beyond Hollywood. During the war, the government asked her to change it because it was considered dangerous for women working in factories, yet the studio resisted altering her brand. Lake herself felt trapped inside an image she no longer wanted, realizing that her fame was tied to a single visual gimmick rather than her acting ability. Her private life continued to unravel as Hollywood clung to the illusion. She endured a series of troubled marriages, financial collapse, and long periods of unemployment. Yet the public was shielded from much of this, fed glamorous photographs and carefully crafted narratives, while Lake battled alcoholism and declining mental health in silence. By the end of her life, the gap between the icon and the real woman had grown tragically wide. Veronica Lake remains a haunting example of a star who lived inside a lie, one built from beauty mystery, and an industry unwilling to see the truth behind its own creation. 1. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo became one of the most iconic and enigmatic stars in Hollywood history, an actress whose beauty, poise, and quiet intensity defined an entire era of cinema. To the public, she was the embodiment of mystery, a woman who seemed almost ethereal above ordinary life, untouchable and unknowable. Her famous plea, "I want to be alone," helped solidify her as a mythic figure who lived in serene isolation by choice. Yet nearly everything about Garbo's public persona, her aloofness, her privacy, even her mystique, was a carefully constructed illusion that hid a far more complex and vulnerable reality. Garbo's image as the reclusive, silent goddess was not born naturally, but sculpted deliberately by studios and publicists. They realized early that her quiet demeanor could be transformed into a marketable mystique, so they rewrote interviews, limited her public appearances, and promoted her as an aloof, almost supernatural figure. The Garbo the world knew was less a person and more a cinematic creation, a figure crafted to appear above human concerns, even though she struggled intensely with them in private. Her personal identity was another closely guarded secret. Garbo lived in a time when the truth about her romantic relationships, especially those with women, could have ended her career. Because of this, her private life became a fortress of secrecy. Publicists created fictional romances with male co-stars, staged photographs, and fabricated narratives to maintain the illusion of conventional femininity. Meanwhile, Garbo wrestled with profound loneliness, uncertainty, and the burden of living a life that could not be openly shared. She was also far from the emotionless figure the world imagined. Behind closed doors, Garbo suffered from periods of depression, isolation, and crippling self-doubt. She disliked fame, felt uncomfortable with attention, and often feared that she was incapable of living up to the legendary status Hollywood had imposed on her. The public saw calm elegance and control. Garbo lived with anxiety, insecurity, and a deep longing for genuine connection. Even her retirement added to the lie. Fans believed she left Hollywood because she preferred solitude, but in truth, she felt trapped by an industry that valued her myth more than her humanity. She understood that the Garbo persona could never coexist with authentic personal freedom, so she vanished to preserve the illusion, knowing her true self would never be accepted by the world that idolized her. Greta Garbo remains the ultimate symbol of Hollywood illusion, a woman turned into a myth, forced to live a life defined by secrets the world still struggles to uncover. Fame can create legends, but it can also bury the truth. Behind every spotlight is a story reshaped, rewritten, or erased to fit the fantasy the world wants to believe. These stars lived lives defined by illusion, some by force, some by survival, and some because Hollywood left them no other choice. If you found their hidden stories eye-opening, make sure you stay with us. Tick Tick will keep uncovering the secrets, lies, and forgotten truths the industry never wanted you to see. Remember to subscribe because the next story we reveal might be one Hollywood hoped you'd never hear. Thank you for watching, and until next time, nothing in this town is ever what it seems.